the last day of the Singapore Literature Festival. My name is Mohammed Saleh. I'm the programs manager here at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and we are so very glad to have you. Yeah, come on. If we start here, we only have up to go, for the rest of the day. So that's the goal. It's an absolute honor for us to host the last day of this festival. Thank you to Lily, NG, and the rest of Singapore Unbound for choosing our space to host this day. A little bit about the Asian American Writers Workshop. We're a nonprofit organization. We've been around for 30 plus years. And our goal, really, our MO, has been to expand and amplify Asian American writing. We do so from what we like to call a radically inclusive ethos. What that means, in practical terms, is expanding the definition not only of what it means to be an Asian American, but also what it means to be a writer. Thank you all for joining us. Just a couple of very quick housekeeping remarks. We have 2 gender-neutral bathrooms in the back. Masking is strongly encouraged. And if you need a moment to yourself, to reflect, to pause for anything at all, we have the back room over there, and we have our offices, so you can just let me know, and I'll be glad to show you. And with that, I would like to pass it back to Lily, please. And
please forgive our sort of ruffling around in the back. We will have coffee and some snacks set up shortly as well. If you're hungry, if you need something to drink, please help yourselves. So, good afternoon. Thank you all so very much for joining us as we kick off the second day of programming at the 2024 Singapore Literature Festival. My name is Lily Philpott, along with G. Leon Ko, who you met at the door. I am a co-director of this year's festival. We have a very full day. We're glad you're with us, and we can't wait to get started. Our first panel of the day, I wanted to thank Mohammed again, as well as the rest of the staff at the AAWW. This is a really special space. This is sort of the heart of Asian American literary community in New York City. I feel like maybe we can expand that out to the East Coast as well. So we are really glad to be here. Thank you, Mohammed, again. Our first panel of the day is titled Multilingual Existence. It will consider the ways so many of us are constantly adapting and moving between language, genre, gender, art, forms, culture, and so much more. We'll be joined by Dena Igusti, Simon Wu, and Grace Jung, and moderator Aruni Kayshap. I'm going to read Aruni's bio, and then he will introduce the rest of the panel. Aruni Kayshap is the author of The Way You Want to Be Loved, which is for sale in the back, and the novel The House with a Thousand Stories, as well as How to Date a Fanatic, which will be out from Harper Via in 2026. Along with editing a collection of stories called How to Tell the Story of an Insurgency, he translated 2 novels from Assamese to English, published by Zuban Books and Penguin Random House. The recipient of a Harvard Radcliffe Fellowship, the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, the Faculty Research Grants in the Humanities and Arts Program, and the Charles Wallace India Trust Scholarship for Creative Writing, the University of Edinburgh. His poetry collection, There Is No Good Time for Bad News, was nominated for the 58th Georgia Author of the Year Awards in 2022. His short stories, poems, and essays have appeared in Catapult, the Boston Review, Electric Lit, the Oxford Anthology of Writings from the Northeast, and many more. He is an associate professor of English and creative writing and the director of the creative writing program at the University of Georgia, Athens. Woo!
I'm going to introduce our panelists today, and I'm going to just point towards one of them and I introduce them, and you can probably say hello. This is Grace Jung, and Grace Jung is an internationally touring stand-up comedian, filmmaker, translator, and author of her latest book, K-Drama School, a pop culture inquiry into why we love Korean television, as if we needed more reasons. Her academic articles on TV, film, gender, and sexuality are published in multiple journals. She's a former Fulbright scholar and a visiting assistant professor of Korean studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She and her work are featured in Time Magazine, Literary Hub, and NPR. This is Grace. Here is Simon. Simon Wu is a writer and artist. His writing has been published in the Paris Review, Book Forum, The Drift, and The New Yorker. His first book, Dancing on My Own, was published in 2024 with HarperCollins. He has organized exhibitions and programs at the Brooklyn Museum, the Whitney Museum, the Kitchen, MoMA, and David Zwirner, among other venues. In 2021, he was awarded an Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant and was featured in Culture Magazine's Young Curators series. He was a 2018 Helena Rubinstein Curatorial Fellow at the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program and is currently in the PhD program in the History of Art at Yale University. He has two brothers, Nick and Duke, and loves the ocean. Please welcome Simon. It's my pleasure to continue introducing. This is Dena Igusti. Dena is an Indonesian Muslim writer born and raised in Queens, New York. They are the author of Catwoman, Game Over Books 2020. It was published in 2020, which has been listed as a 2022 Perennial Award winner, 2020 Harvard Bookstore Staff Pick, and Entropy Mag's Best of 2020 to 2021. They are the inaugural 2023 New York Foundation for Arts Ryan Hudak Playwright Award winner. Their work has been featured in BOAAT Press, Peregrine Journal, Color Block, and other publications. Their work has been produced and performed at LA Times, the Brooklyn Museum, the Apollo Theater, Women Deliver, the 2018 Teen Vogue Summit, Players Theater, the Public, and more. They have been featured in Business Insider, Teen Vogue, American Theater Magazine, and more. They are a More Art Engaging Artist Fellow, NYSCA grant recipient, Asian American Writers Workshop Open City Fellow, Baldwin for the Arts recipient, Best of the Net nominee, and more. They have been commissioned by the Miranda Family Fund. They have a forthcoming poetry collection, 14 poems, published from London in 2025. Please welcome Dena. We will have now our presentations, and I would request Grace to come up to the stage, take any of the seats you favor, and go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Grace Jung. Lily, can we get the first slide, please? That's the second slide. First, okay, thank you. So this is my current book, K-Drama School, Pop Culture in Korea to Why We Love Korean Television. It's my first nonfiction book, published by Running Press, which is with the Kayshap book group. And I would say this is like a trinity. It's like a three-prong kind of project where I'm conducting textual analysis of Korean dramas, so Korean TV shows, like a text, but I'm also interweaving it with my own personal memoir aspects because Korean history is just so riddled with national trauma. So I'm using my personal trauma as like a parallel to the national state trauma and also bringing in the historical context as well. So it's got academic rigor, but also my own personal prose and also textual analysis. So it's a very unique kind of book. I hate this mic. Can I do a different microphone? Because this one is coming in and out. It sucks.
It's the same actually.
That one also? Is it
Let's hope
I'll try this one. Thank you. So yeah, like if you've seen Squid Game, The Glory, or any other old school K-dramas like Autumn in My Heart or whatever, then yeah, this would be a fun book for you. Okay, next slide, please. So before that, this was my first novel, which I published, I think, in 2014. I was like so young at the time, and I was sort of in this like unique spot. So this was like, I graduated into the 2008-2009 economic recession after 8 years of George W. Bush economy. And it was a very harrowing time. And like, I remember as soon as I got back from my Fulbright stint, there was a New York Times article basically blaming the millennials for why the economy was fucked. And I was like, Well, I mean, I have a college education and I'm a Fulbrighter and I'm working 7 days a week at 3, 4 different part-time jobs. Who fucked up, you or me? You know, so this was sort of like my Marxist, New York City cashier novel, where it's just 2 days, 1 weekend, yeah, she's just narrating like what she's seeing in her day-to-day in this dense New York City deli right on 33rd Street. It used to be there, it used to be called Applebaum Deli, but they didn't make it through the pandemic. But yeah, I remember working there and writing this book. So this was published by Thought Catalog Books, which is a Brooklyn press. They used to have this website that the millennials loved called Thought Catalog, and there were like these essays that I would write and they would publish me, and they were very supportive. And when they started doing the book thing, they decided to publish my book, which was really great, because at the time, like, nobody gave a shit about Korean American experiences. None whatsoever. No agent cared, no press cared, nobody gave a shit. And suddenly Korea is a hot commodity, right? So it's interesting how like popular culture turns, and then the way that people's perspectives change when it comes to, oh, like we see you now versus we never saw you before. So yeah, I really have a lot of gratitude to Thought Catalog Books. Next slide, please. So these are 2 ebook novellas that Thought Catalog published. The very first one here is The Moon Hangs Like a Stupid Mistake. That's actually a title taken from an Alexander Blok poem, a Russian poet. And then Gethsemane is the other novella. Gethsemane is no longer in print, but The Moon Hangs is still on Amazon. Both of them are ebooks though. There's a smaller like magazine, online magazine called Molotov Cocktail. They were cool enough to publish a short story I had written years ago. And the Cortland Review also published a short story I'd written. So yeah, just tinkering around with short stories, tinkering around with like books that are not quite novels and not quite a short story, like 6,000 to 10,000 words kind of situation. Thought Catalog was very supportive in that regard. So yeah, when I think about me as like a young writer back then and the support that I got from these people, like I feel a lot of gratitude and warmth. Next slide, please. So I am also a translator. When I was at Pace University, that's where I majored in English. My poet in residence mentor, Charles North, who was part of the New York School of Poets, he was very encouraging. And he was like, you know, you might as well just translate some stuff. And the first poet that I came across is named Yi Hang. And he's like a pretty well-known modernist Korean poet in South Korea. And if you guys have read that book, Same But Different Dreams by Ed Park, Yi Hang is like a major player in that book as well. So I translated a bunch of his poems. So that's Yi Hang up there, the black and white photo. And then I translated a novella by Yi Chungjun, he's not a modernist per se, not a postmodernist either. He's kind of in between. I don't even know how to like categorize him. But he wrote a novella called 벌레 이야기, which means like the story of a bug. And that was turned into a film by Yi Chang-dong, who made this film called Secret Sunshine, which won an award, Best Actress Award at Cannes. And then, yeah, so that's there. And then Hanford Star, which is a pretty big like translation publishing house in London, they reached out to me and asked me if I would be interested in translating Kim Dong-in's short stories. So I decided to do that, and this beautiful cover down here is that. And then The Offing magazine was like, we'd like to take an excerpt from Sweet Potato and put it in our magazine. I was like, yeah, go ahead, do your thing. So I also do some translations, but I personally don't like to translate literature anymore. It's a really thankless kind of job for a writer, and it does require a lot of energy. I think all translators would know this. Last slide, please. Also, when I was like in between writing, I love interviewing other writers and artists. I interviewed Mari Naomi, who's like a very big Asian American graphic novelist. Her book Dragon's Breath was really lovely. I got to interview her and write a small book review. And I love like interviewing women that I would like to like strive to be, like aspire to be. So when I was like in my early 20s, I really didn't have like a lot of good role models or mentors. So a lot of these artists were people I looked up to. And Mari Naomi was like definitely up there for me. Viv Albertine, she's part of the Slits, a huge punk rock band And she wrote this great memoir, and I interviewed her just over email, but it was like such a terrifying experience because she's like so cool in my world. So yeah, like those little experiences also helped build my confidence over the years and sort of worked as like a navigational guide for me. And there's some other like smaller essays that I published on Warscapes magazine. And then Literary Hub was able to publish an excerpt of my book, which is all about like why K-dramas have so much amnesia. So that's my little show and tell. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Grace, for that presentation. I also love that Bill Albertine book, the title of which is Music, 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 Close, 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 Boys, 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 which is the best title ever. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So I just brought some images. Too loud? Okay. Lily, I'm going to have to annoy you somewhat just to click through them, perhaps, but I am a artist who studied studio art, and then after school was like, how am I going to make money? And so I started working in museums and found that curating was a way that I could work with my friends and still be around artists and really learn from them. And so I found that gradually I gravitated towards artists who in some ways were perhaps Asian American or Asian diasporic and also queer, and it felt partly a kind of recuperative project of like not really seeing a lot of artists who look like that. And so in 2021 I worked on the show at David's Werner by the Hong Kong Cuban artist Ching Ho Chang, and there's this kind of whole history of artists in New York who maybe we would retrospectively kind of label as an Asian American artist, but at the time would have sort of resented even the label themselves. And so Ching is someone like that who, you know, preferred to consider himself a mystic rather than someone who was Asian. And this was a really wonderful show that we were able to put together that he hadn't shown in New York in over 25 years. But with this kind of renewed lens, he himself was sort of a queer Asian American artist who was making very small, sort of thoughtful canvases in the Chelsea Hotel, a lot of which was conveyed by working with his sister, who still lives in his studio and manages his estate. So Lily, if I could ask you maybe to just, so these are some more images. These are the sort of psychedelic works that he was doing in the early 70s. And they are very inspired by sort of his travels in Istanbul and Eastern religion, but also being in the kind of nightlife scene of 1970s New York, spending time with people like Andy Warhol and stuff like that. We could go to the next slide, Lily. I think before I started working historically, I was working with friends first and foremost, and a lot of that involved putting together shows to feel like essentially that I was collaboratively working with a lot of artists that I admired. And so this is a more recent show that in my head is just like a show of friends who happen to be Asian American and are queer and are working around different ideas of the body. And Revolt of the Body is a quote from a Japanese Gutai artist and looks at different kinds of ways that people were kind of dealing with, contemporary Asian American artists were dealing with the idea of the body. So there's Dean Samashino's work on the left, where he took erotic gay magazines from the 70s and made them as connect the dot paintings. So when you look at them and you kind of follow along the numbers, you kind of find new images or surprising images than you would have expected. Lily, we can go to the next slide. And these are works by Cole Liu, who I find is like super metal, like he just like carves stuff into wood with fire, and is really inspired by kind of mythic religions and also kind of like Albrecht Dürer and kind of like very sort of European old inscriptions, but often is incorporating elements of his own life into the works themselves. So if Lily, we could go to the next slide. Some of this sort of led to me taking this approach that I had used in these kind of like white cube sanitized spaces, and then thinking about it in my own life essentially. And what really instigated the book project that I had come out with in June earlier this year was this kind of encounter basically between my mom's Victoria's Secret bag and then a bag by the kind of queer unisex black artist Tal Farr Clemens, who's from Queens, and how my mom said, why did you spend $120 on a plastic or vegan bag, and trying to understand why it was that she would be very interested in someone like Victoria's Secret and why I would be into someone like Tal Farr, and how to understand the gap between that. So if we could go to the next slide. Part of that meant that I started writing about it, and a lot of that writing went into the book. Because this panel is about multilingual existence, I write primarily in English, but I speak Burmese at home. I speak English and Turkish with my partner. But I feel that probably the languages I work across the most are like art and writing, because I never thought that I would really be a writer. I always thought I would be an artist. But it felt that I needed to actually start writing in order to get some of the ideas back. And so after that encounter, I worked on a show in Chinatown here at Helena Anrather, where the kind of central focus was this show-off between my Telfar bag and my mom's Victoria's Secret bag. But the kind of greater idea that after I started cleaning out a lot of my parents' stuff in their garage during COVID, that there was just so much sort of excess aesthetic kind of interest in all those objects, and it felt that if we could just present them in a gallery in a way that you could see some of that, you could kind of make that vision possible. So maybe Lily, we could just slip through some of these. The other thing I did was kind of incorporate a lot of artists who were my friends and had themselves relationships with their own parents' work. So if you go back maybe one more slide, or, well, yeah, we can go forward actually. This is actually the work that ended up being on the cover of my book, which is maybe somewhere around, I'll show it. And it's by the artist Leon Shu, and it is kind of serendipitous that he was also showing at the gallery that I met, and I saw that and I was like, I think that has to be on the cover. And I can say more about it maybe later, but we can maybe go to the next slide where, oh yeah, there's the book. And the book itself is about my family and art that talks about family. So in addition to thinking about my mom and the kind of gaps that happen between there, it also considers other Asian American artists who are thinking about their relationship to their parents or their relationship to the idea of Asian America to begin with. And also looks a lot back into history of kind of different Asian American artist collectives that I had never heard of, like Godzilla or the Basement Workshop, that in a lot of ways felt like to me gave me a sort of lineage of being in New York that I wasn't aware of before. So if we go to the next slide, when the book came out in June, it felt more apparent to me that I wanted to do another show about it. And so I think something that characterizes or I'm learning about myself is that I really have to work between these two mediums, where I'm making work and then I'm writing about it, and then it turns into art, and then it turns back into writing. So for a while I've made clothes with my mom, and usually this stems from me wanting things that I can't afford, and then I show them to my mom and she's like, I can just make that. So this is us going to Joann's, and then her rendition of this like Acne Studio sweater that costs an arm and a leg. And so we had been doing this for a while, and if we go to the next slide, it became another thing to contend with, basically between her taste and mine, where she would make stuff and I'd be like, I love that for you, I find it really ugly, but you love it, so I love it for you. And it's this constant sort of negotiation of taste, and what does taste mean? Why do I have the taste I do? Why does she do? If we go to the next slide, we started making these stuffed animals that felt like also a kind of way that I was writing about her a lot in the book, and it felt like somehow writing about her was actually pulling me away from her, and so I wanted to do something material with my hands that felt like brought us together. and I just love stuffed animals. And as my late 20s, my new hobby is that I just collect them again. And so we were like, oh, well, we should just make some, and it was fun to sort of experiment with things that the yellow thing was supposed to be a flower, and then my mom said, now it's a butterfly. And those are kind of matching his and hers dumplings, and then a watermelon. That's my grandma, who also sat around and helped us. And if we go to the next slide, part of this was thinking about other artists who were also working in this space, where they would go home and see things. And this is by the artist Jared Liu, his series Please Take Off Your Shoes, where he stages these very sort of dramatic reenactments of things that are very, very common in a lot of Asian American households. And I saw them and I was just so struck by them. I reached out to him, and if we go to the next slide, here's another one of his fantastic works. And if we go to the next slide, he was really kind enough to be able to shoot my author photo, which is in the back of the book, and we just started collaborating. And if we go to the next slide, here's another one where he essentially came to my house in Philadelphia and spent the weekend there, and met my parents, and we took a lot of pictures. So all of this was sort of like energy around the book, essentially. And if we go to the next slide, this is like my little brother's room, and this is the photograph he was able to take of it. And I think in many ways it just sort of like legitimized how I felt about these interiors to begin with, where a lot of my background is in these institutions that are very, refined and like white cube-like, but I was like, this is just as interesting, if not more, by many means. If we go to the next slide, so all of this sort of culminated in this exhibition that came out around my book that was titled Cuteness is the Beauty I Can Afford, which is the beauty I deserve. And so there's a photograph of my brother's room, and these are the clothes that my mom was able to make for me. In both this show and the last show, my partner, who's an architect, was able to help design all the things. So I mention these people because it's really emblematic of how I like to work, which is the people around me and the people that I love the most. So we can maybe click through some of these slides. So here's some more. That's me. That's my little brother in his room, Jared shot, and we had spent like a half a day trying to stage this whole thing, and then my little brother's like, I'm gonna go rest in my room. So, and then we walked in and we were like, that's perfect, like don't move. That's exactly the shot. And if we go to the next slide, yeah, there's me and my grandma and my little brother. There's my mom at her little station where she makes things. We can keep going. Yeah, that's me and my middle brother Nick, and then the mysterious feet are my youngest brother Duke, and some of the figures that we ended up making. Yeah, there's some more shots. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Hi, my name is Dena Igusti. I am a playwright and a poet born and raised in Queens, New York, and a lot of my work focuses on anticipated grief, anticipated loss, and kind of also the history of migration of Queens Muslims from the late 80s to current present. A lot of my work focuses mainly on Indonesian Muslims in particular, and centers around Elmhurst and where I grew up in South Ocean Park, and also how that intersects with queerness, again, anticipated loss and grief, and all of that jazz. Lily, I will also undertake you with this. So this is a poster from a play that had premiered last year at Connolly Theater. It is called First Sight, and it is kind of based on like a rendition. It was made by A. Edwards, and it was directed by Sarah Rothman. But it is kind of a play that kind of just centers around the Indonesian queer zine scene, especially the lesbian zine scene in Jakarta, and how it migrated from Jakarta, and then afterwards, the 1998 riots kind of moved over to Queens, New York City, but in like little pockets. So it is a romance story. It focuses on this aspiring karaoke singer named Sadi and how she falls in love with this journalist turned zine editor named Lisa. But then as soon as the 1998 riots came due to US back coup, due to the fall of Suharto, who was a dictator in Indonesia, who ended up being like backed by CIA in various facets. But due to the fall of his dictatorship and the riots, Saudi is forced to migrate to Queens and also kind of be in this like straight cis heterosexual nuclear family for the most part, and also kind of repressed her romance for Lisa. So the whole play kind of centers around that, but it was based on a culmination of interviews with queer Indonesians who were affected by Suharto's reign during the 90s and also during the 2000s. So it was based on a culmination of interviews with two generations of Indonesian queers and their relationship with both like the concept of coming out, quote unquote, as well as kind of the idea of how they've had to navigate love in a way where assimilation was very essential for their survival. So we can go to the next slide. This is the cover of my book. It is called Cut Woman. It is published by Game Over Books, and it was when I was really, really, really young, way before 25. So you get the gist of that. But yeah, this book kind of just centers around my relationship with grief, especially as somebody who grew up in Queens and was affected by both gentrification, mass eviction. Around 2006, my family ended up being evicted from Queens, and then there was a brief moment where we did live in Lower East Side. And because of NYU's expansion of their campus, there was also a wide increase in gentrification, which led to mass evictions, including my family. And a lot of my neighbors and a lot of my friends also ended up being evicted as well, and also, by extension, either due to forms of houselessness or other housing instabilities, it led to a lot of deaths, whether it was just because of the lack of support. So part of it was navigating that. The other half of this book focuses on me being a survivor of female genital cutting, and basically kind of navigating that grief of what my body would have been in terms of navigating it. How I wanted to have constant agency over my body, and how do I want to control that grief, and kind of come to terms with the ways in which I need to and can lose people, and also kind of just generally navigating the fact that or coming to terms with the fact that death is not necessarily this deadline, but this space that it kind of exists, and it's a whole other stage that I have to navigate on its own. So yeah, that is my book. We can go over to the next slide. This is kind of just a photo of the same play of First Sight. This is the lead actress who played Sadi. Her name is Victoria Pamela. But yeah, a lot of my work basically focuses on both docu-poetics and docu-theater. It is mainly a culmination of oral histories of community members, usually Indonesian. The reason why I focus on documentary theater and documentary poetics in particular is because it does allow me to have a culmination of one big narrative and be able to not necessarily platform, but to be able to talk about specific stories without compromising the identities of a lot of the folks. Like with First Sight, for instance, it was talking about queerness, but a lot of the women that were interviewed already had a husband and already had kids, and they had a time in their life where they were very active in the queer community in Jakarta, but they weren't able to do that in New York City, and are not safe to do so. So having this play and kind of having it was kind of this buffer and this way of being able to talk about that without necessarily compromising their identities, especially when a lot of them were also my own aunties and my own cousins and a lot of facets. And then the same thing goes with poetry in a similar way of that. I do work a lot with survivors of female genital cutting, as well as folks who have been affected by post 9/11, especially because Indonesia was seen as the CIA's ethnicity of interest. There were a lot of folks with my uncles, aunts who were either interrogated, who were either deported, or I honestly, to be frank, have never seen them again. They just went missing and never saw them again. So a lot of my work part of it is my selfishness of I am so afraid of loss, and because of that, I'm just trying to hold on to them beyond my own memory. But then there's also the other aspect of it, of understanding and trying to figure out how to not necessarily anonymize these narratives, but more so how to talk about these stories without compromising anyone's safety. You can go over to the next slide, Lily. Oh, this is, wait, sorry, Lily. Is it okay if we don't play it, but I'll talk about it? Because I was very young and I was in my teens. And of course, like every other Asian poet, I was in what? Slam. So this was kind of that time. This was like a performance I had at Lincoln Center. But like basically it's called America Barges Into My Pity Party. And it is in my book Cut Woman, but it basically just recounts me navigating being a survivor of female genital cutting, but more so the ways in which both Western media and also just generally victimhood and survivorhood is presented, in that it was, my body felt like it was often used against, to constantly emphasize Islamophobia, some form of xenophobia, and that it's like, oh my God, this horrible, barbaric thing happened to you. How could this happen? This poor savage community, all that jazz. And like a lot of this poem was meant to counteract that and to kind of focus on that survival. The only reason why I don't want to play it is because the first half of it is me just talking about it and recounting the whole experience. It's also a thing where I think being in Slam, like there was also like that pressure of like being like kind of trauma mining. So it's a very thing where like I'm proud of the poem towards the end of it, but the first half of it I'm not super in love with. We go to the next slide. No, you're so fine, you're so fine. This one is when I was a part of LA Times. This was from FAM. They were doing a showcase of different like food landscapes in LA. I want to also remind you that I'm not from LA. They sent me an email, they were like, hey, like you're an Indonesian poet, can you talk about Indonesia? And here we are. If y'all know the singer Nikki, we were in the same video. That will not be shown, but we were in the same video. But yeah, like basically this poem that we're about to play is technically a docu-poetics piece in that it uses basically like excerpts of different interviews that I had with my family who was a part of like the Indonesian like food scene in the early 2000s. As well as some other elders and like how they talked about their relationship with food. It also is a piece about the ways in which Indonesian elders can recognize Indonesians no matter what. Like, I remember like Zach Morris was like on Saved by the Bell and my dad was like, he's Indonesian, like at least he's half. And we're like, no, he's not. And like later on we found out, turns out he is half Indonesian, and we just knew that, not from Google, but the strength of his face. So this poem is an ode to that. And again, it came from Slam, so just be considerate of that.
Show, please welcome Indonesian poet and artist Dena Igusti.
Raja Gemini graces the drag race main stage with the Balinese dance. Or, my parents knew Michelle Branch's Indonesian before they could Google it. Or, did you know one of the Pussycat Dolls is Indonesian? If not us, then maybe our faces will find a way home. Maybe everything I needed to know has always been corporeal, relied on the crinkle of eye. The beige of my mother and aunties who could only pass down certain pains for promised purity. The veins of my father and uncles whom I have and will never meet. The blood of all my siblings. How it pours from forehead to mouth after diving headfirst into a dare made by all our childhood friends. Yet they grin with sun, sneer, don't worry y'all, I'm still handsome. How smoke, among other fluids, escapes our mouths. At least I won't die after this. My heirloom's not gold, but think too much without forming lines across the forehead. Have a gap between its teeth. Gather in cacophonies of laughter and lilting in cramped apartments. Sway their hips to a dangdut track on a YouTube karaoke video. Gorge and gnash their teeth into pinks and greens and browns and yellows and golds and oranges and purples. Make a delicacy of reds, not from our own blood, spread across white centerfold tables. Extend the last syllable of all our sentences, so we speak only in everlasting song. name won't matter one day. The last name will disappear to anecdote. Everyone after me will still have to call a patch of dirt, stale air, water, the bottom of a street lamp someone else's name. Indonesian will still find its way out of my mouth like smoke, but I'll always know the shape of its lips. Can y'all tell I came from Slam? Can y'all tell I came from Slam? Anyway, what I'm currently working on now, I'm at a residency with the Brooklyn Public Library, and it is called Chronologues. So it is a multimedia found choreo poem series that basically is a discussion with Southeast Asian New York City locals, those specifically who've been around for at least 5 years or more. Their relationship with grief, both current and anticipatory. So what I'm doing, it is both a video installation as well as a big monologue piece and movement piece. But what I'm having is participants come in, bring an object that does represent that form of grief. It could be either a Cape Cod sweatshirt or a letter or anything along those lines, and why that represents grief for them. And afterwards, after videotaping all these interviews, they will all be spliced and edited into one found poem, which will both be performed and also be edited into its own video installation. And the reason why I'm doing this is because a lot, especially with how I grew up, especially being Indonesian, and the ways in which we've had to navigate archive, and that I don't have these formal family trees, but I definitely have my mom's Cape Cod sweatshirt from when she came here, and I have her Boy London jean jacket from when she first came to New York, and that is so much more of a remnant of kind of our family history, a little bit more than kind of having this formal family tree of the Igusti family in Bali. So yeah. And also, I will be doing an artist talk at the Brooklyn Public Library, Brooklyn Heights, this Thursday. And I'm still also doing a call for interviews, both on Tuesday and on the 29th. We can go to the next slide for that, Lily, the last one. But yeah, just right now, I'm in the interview stage of the piece. And each session will take about 15 to 25 minutes, but yeah, right now, that's kind of what's happening, where if you're Southeast Asian and you also have been here for some time and would like to, please reach out. But yeah, that's all about me.
Thank you. I was about to ask that. Thank you so much. Please come and have your seats here in the green couch. Okay, so we have a mic here. We can probably share this around, and I'm also happy to learn mine. But thank you very much for all your presentations. They were so fascinating and so rich. I feel that my job is really to probably just point to people who want to ask questions, but I do have some questions from myself. But I think all of you, made wonderful remarks about your own work and enabled us to contextualize it. So I don't have much to ask because I think they were so well done. But I'm still very curious. So these questions are coming from curiosity, and I hope it might help some of the audience members as well. There are writers and scholars here. What I saw that in all your 3 books, and what each one of you do is rigorous research, rigorous field work, rigorous rigorous research, rigorous field work, and going to the field, talking to people is a very, very important part of that. At the same time, each one of you blend the final product is a blend of your personal experience, amazing writing style, there's humor, there is imagination, there's vividness. Both of you are writing non-fiction, Simon and you, and Dena, yours is poetry. So what are the techniques and what are the tools or what are the different ways you actually use in order to transform that rigorous research into these beautiful essays and poetry?
Yeah.
Sorry about the mic.
Can y'all hear me? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so for me, at the very least, with poetry in particular, I think, and also with theater, a lot of how I kind of navigate like the research process. Well, first, I think because most of it drives from oral interviews, and a lot of it does come from field interviews for the most part. I think I do put risk assessment, and I also put safety kind of as a priority, at least for my work, especially because the Indonesian Muslim community is relatively small, and also because it is a thing where we have been affected by how heavy surveillance in from the beginning, especially in the early 2000s. So I try to be as cautious as possible. So a lot of it is also just, first it is just trying to omit as much identifying information as possible, which is a lot more logistical. But then afterwards, kind of delving into, based on that, what are the truths that I do want to come out of it? What are the emotional truths that I want to hone in on and what I do want to focus on? Sometimes it's a thing where it is trending patterns, where what are the trending common narratives that I do see in the docu-poetic sense. And oftentimes it is about grief and loss, but when it is a thing where I am focusing on my own work and I'm kind of focusing on my own experiences and my own traumas, I do kind of go into it with its own lens of kind of okay, I know that I want to talk about my fears of loss and my fears of anticipated loss. What are kind of the other interviews that kind of relate or kind of correlate to that, at least to a certain degree?
Yeah, when I was writing this K-drama school, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted it to be this three-pronged thing with a personal narrative and academic rigor and historical contextualization. But writing in that way is really hard because academic writing is so impersonal and very dry and boring as hell. So I was trying to put together different kinds of my brain was changing as I was writing this, because you can't really put the subjective into the academic writing a lot of the times. It's impossible, actually. In fact, we're trained to not do that. We're trained to shut off an entire half of ourselves. And I was starting to light that part of myself back up while writing this, and it was such a different experience for me. It was a whole new kind of schooling for me. And once I achieved that, I was I got this shit. No way is my academic writing ever gonna be that terrible ever again. In fact, none of your students wanna read the shit you guys assign because it's so terrible. So what you all need to do is write with your own voice and not try to cater to some asshole peer reviewer who has no heart, So that's, juice it up, you know? If we're writing about culture, juice it up with your personal voice, because what's the point otherwise? What's the point when we write this and nobody reads it and then it goes, what? For what, So, we really need to rewrite academic writing, and we really need to, bring those two hemispheres back together. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. I mean, also we love these things despite the very heavy subject material. We love these topics. How do you write about something you love with so much detachment and so much dry, boring thing, attitude? That's what I'm so I totally agree with what you say. Simon, please.
No, yeah, thank you for that, Grace. I feel as someone who also is someone in school, I really relate to that, and I feel it also informed how I was approaching material. I feel I turned to research often because I didn't know how to do things. I don't know how to write a personal essay, but I know how to think about an artwork or an artist, and it felt that I was writing art criticism, and so often the most profound art experience I would have about it was not when I was at the museum and I was tired or hungry or needed to pee, but really later when I'm on in a bar or on a dance floor or on a date, and I'm oh, that artwork just comes back to me in some way. So that was one way that I felt that art would come back to me in different ways, and that's how I wanted to represent it in the book. But then also that research in learning about many of these artists, who some of whom are friends and then many of whom are dead or are no longer with us, they served as kind of models for ways of existing that I hadn't thought were possible in New York. You know, I grew up in Philadelphia. I moved here in 2017, so I didn't grow up here, but there was this inexplicable sense that there were other people here who had done art stuff who were Asian, and then the more you look, the more came out, and that's kind of what drove a lot of the research, where I was like, oh, like, first it was the kind of experience of recognition, where it feels warm and good, and then you feel a little angry, like, why didn't I know about this? Like, this person is so famous, why haven't I known about it? So I guess research in history served to kind of like sandblast the present, so it's like, oh, okay, it's not what you thought it was, but it's better, or maybe, or it's different. Yeah.
We all come from very deeply underrepresented literary traditions. I come from a state in India. Until recently, even people in India didn't know where it is. They often thought one needed a passport to go to Assam, and they would ask me. So I'm talking about 10 years ago, but things not have improved a lot. But what I'm trying to say is that I think all of us come from underrepresented literary traditions, and as a result, there are few of us, you know, in this Anglophone space, in this space of New York, and we are often negotiating not just personal trauma. Grace, you mentioned a little bit of that, and you also mentioned a little bit of that, how national trauma actually filters into our writing. As a result of that, you know, whatever we write, people, it's not because of our fault, but it's because people read it that way. It becomes the only story. How do you negotiate that? How do you, how do you walk around that and dance around that? Anyone can pick up the phone and say start. I want to hear from all three of you.
For me, like, I had to just keep in mind that any trauma stuff that I was gonna share, it's been shared before. There's nothing unique or special about what I've gone through that isn't more or less important than what anybody else has gone through. And so for me, it's like, I was burying everything. Name whatever, I have it. And I was like, the only way for me to not feel the shame and burden of this is to put it out in the light of day. And I was like, getting a lot of encouragement just looking at some of my LA friends who are doing one-woman shows, who do a lot of that stuff and bear it out. And I was like, how are you doing it? And she's just like, there's nothing new here. And I'm like, you're right. Like, I've read all of these stories before. And so I was like, there's nothing personal here, actually, because we're all one. So put it out there, and then put in the national context there. I was like, okay, so now we know the bigger picture. But is it just the Korean nation state? No, it's like you could look at all of Asia and say there were hot wars happening during the quote-unquote Cold War era. And then look at it also like, we're so arrogant sometimes. Like, we're not the only civilization that has existed in this contemporary era. There have been eons of civilizations that have come and gone. They've all done the same thing. So I was like, this isn't special, but it's a processing. We're rinsing, we're repeating, we're processing something. I just leave it at that. And then now I'm at a point where I'm just like, I don't want to talk about this ever again. You know? Like, that's when you know you're done, like really done. Like, I've rinsed it all out. I get emotional nowadays. I don't even cry anymore, you know? And I'm a Pisces, goddammit. The tears don't come, they're gone, you know? Like, so once I was done, I was like, I never need to open these pages back up again. I don't need to explore this stuff ever again. I just want to go skiing and like swimming and stuff.
It shouldn't be on one writer to do all that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Grace. And I totally echo that. That like, we are not the first to experience the trauma that we do. And like, also in a similar vein, I think like, as somebody who's a survivor of female genital petting, it's always this like big thing in like the US and the West, and not in a way of minimizing it, but like there's an aspect of it where, one, it is constantly weaponized as a way to be super Islamophobic, and also just like very xenophobic in a lot of facets. But I think the other aspect of it is like, similarly, like, while by no means am I, like, while I'm not, like, of course I'm not the only one who has survived, and that, like, okay, I have to minimize my trauma, I'm also not the only one who has survived, in that I have generations of women before me who have also survived this and have had the language for it and have navigated it. I'm just voicing it in the way that I am, and I'm also a part of a culmination of voices rather than, as you were saying, being this one sole voice that represents it, or this one sole voice that saves it in a facet. I think especially with the US, there's like this, especially like now that we're navigating this rise of representation, or like everyone's talking about representation in a particular way. The US loves to be very individualistic and be like, here's the one person that can do it best, here's the sole person that can do it best, rather than kind of seeing that we're just kind of one of several. The ways that I navigate it are informed by me being from Queens and me being like, you know, a little Southside Jamaica girl, and that's pretty much it. And that's like the lens that I go into it when navigating, talking about my trauma. My mother talks about it in a very different way, of being a Jakarta City girl, and like her talking about it in the facets that she does, and then kind of like in any other facet. So I think it has been, what has been like important was for me is to understand that like I am not the sole person for this, and I shouldn't bear that responsibility.
Simon?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for emphasizing the element of both collectivity and sort of intergenerational kind of focus. I feel like in response to an experience of having certain identities put upon you or such, it feels that in many ways I've always felt like I had a very estranged relationship to my background, where I'm Burmese, Chinese, but I also am mostly American, and I feel like those things shift a lot. And at least in the pretext of the book, I felt one thing was that I felt that it was just as important to have stories about kind of collectivity and joy as it was about experiencing trauma and working through trauma. I would also say the other two things were now retrospectively I look at them and I feel like they are forms of one of kind of like disidentifying, where, you know, this like very famous idea from the queer theorist Jose Munoz, where you see something like Crazy Rich Asians and you're like, I don't think that's me, even though this is the main image. Or also, but more interestingly, also maybe like cross-identifying. I felt like that was another thing where in the book I read a lot about the designer that I mentioned, Telfar Clemens, who is himself Liberian American, moved here when he was 5, 6 years old to Lafrac City in Queens, and then was really inspired by the glamour of his aunts and to make this bag. And I was like, that is the most diasporic thing I have ever heard. And I don't need to call it Asian American because it's diasporic and it's so deeply so. And even someone like Andy Warhol, you know, who was originally Andy Warhola and came from Eastern Europe and had this immigrant dream of becoming ubiquitous in some ways. And, you know, there are problems and kind of nuances to it. But I would say, yeah, that cross-identifying was another sort of interesting, important thing because it also builds forms of solidarity and community.
Thank you. This is my last question. I would also open the house for questions from audience. My last question is that we are all at least bilingual, everyone here in this panel, and I wanted to ask you, and we are all, you know, we all bring our bilinguality, the lilt of the other language that we know, I think, to our writing. Are you conscious of that? Are you aware of that? Or have you ever thought of that? And how do you think it surfaces in your work, the bilinguality or the multilinguality?
Yeah, I can just pick up.
Yeah.
I feel like I felt very conscious of that is an understanding within the genre and my approach, and because of my strange relationship to my own background, partly because I felt that I didn't know I had the license to really speak for someone who feels Burmese, because for a long time I was like, oh, I'm Burmese, and I was like, I actually know nothing about Burma. And so I tried to find things that I felt I had more license to, and unexpectedly places that took me where, even though I speak Burmese at home, I feel like in the book, the like homecoming that I have is when I go with my partner who is Turkish to Istanbul, and I have been learning Turkish for the last 3 years, and the experience of learning Turkish and how that kind of crossover into something that is unexpected but feels just as unrooted or something is just as much of a diasporic multilingual experience than something that you speak at home or something that you feel licensed to.
So one thing that used to bother me a lot when I was like a younger writer is like, how much explaining do I have to do? And like, I think that's a burden that all ethnic writers go through. Because like the English literature we were raised on doesn't have to explain anything, right? They don't need to identify anybody's skin color. It's all just assumed, right? So I was like, now I'm at a point where I'm like, I don't give a fuck. Like, I'm gonna write, like my book right now has like Korean written in it. Like I just like write it in Korean, you know? Like sometimes the editor was like, can you translate? I'm like, no, I am not gonna do it. I'm not gonna put a footnote. Go fucking look it up, use AI, you know? Like they have no excuses now. So I write it in a way that is conveniencing me the most. And I'm like, at this point, I deserve it. Because when I was younger, I would question every single choice and wonder, is this gonna like transmit to the other white person? Like, are they gonna see, are they gonna get it? And it's like, now I don't care, so yeah.
Also, American corporate publishing editors need to really have more trust on their readers. The readers are more intelligent than they think, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with Indonesian, it's so interesting, right? In that, like, as a language, I think it's less than 100 years old, but it's like a culmination of all the other islands' languages. So, like, growing up, it was a thing where, like, so much of, like, context just mattered, in that, like, oh, if you're saying something in Indonesian, like, even if one word can mean, like, 20 different things, you just have to be present in the moment, and you just have to know what the situation is, and also just pay attention to who you just have to understand the context. And I think similarly, that was kind of how I approached it with writing in English, but also in general, it was that, like, kind of going into that idea of trust of readers, is that, like, if somebody wants to understand what I'm saying, whether it's Indonesian, whether it's in English, whether it's in Makassarese or Balinese, like, they kind of just have to be present in my work and be present in my writing and know exactly what is kind of like going on, and that, like, it's similar, like, just look it up, but also in another facet of, if you also just get context clues, you'll know what I'm saying, and you don't have to, like, even necessarily go to the full effort of translating something. You'll get it. So I think that's kind of how I've approached it. I think it's also a thing where growing up in Queens, it's a thing where I always grew up with folks who kind of had their own dialects and had their own languages, and it was the thing where we didn't understand each other in a technical sense, but we also understood each other, and we also knew each other's context and knew each other and what we were saying and what generally things would mean. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Questions from the audience. We have 5 minutes. Yeah, no blog posts, please.
So I guess like the first question that was asked was like on your intention in terms of like how to work all of the research into the work. I guess on like the opposite side of that, I'm just wondering briefly like what is it that's like cursory or like totemic or emblematic of the research you're doing that makes you say, I really want to focus on this one thing? Like what makes something stand, like Simon's work was really what had me thinking about it, because like any room could kind of like induce that, but some do more than others, you know what I mean? Yeah.
I think in terms of research, usually it'll either have a kind of personal connection, right? Like, because, oh, this is the house you grew up in or something, and that would draw you. But I also think the other thing that would pull me is that it usually has like a contradiction at the center of it, where other spaces I talk about a lot are like dance floor spaces or something like that, where you're competing between a feeling of like, oh, like I like to feel completely lost in this thing, but then it also cost me $50 to get into this rave. So that's like a contradiction, and that makes me want to research more or something. And similar with a garage, where I'm like, I want to throw everything out. Why does my mom want to keep everything? So I think those contradictions usually want me to research more.
I'm sorry to disrupt us. I know Grace needs to leave to catch a flight, so I just want to ask for preemptive applause. Audience questions? Sorry about that.
Yeah, please. Do you want to respond to the first question? Yeah. And we can take one more question probably.
Yeah, I think kind of in a similar facet, I think almost on the opposite end, where like there are aspects of my life where like they were very important to me, and I think I lean towards what will I miss, and like what are the things that kind of remind me of everyone that I miss and I love. And that like the things that like Marlboro 100s, I will always love dearly, and the smell of them I will love dearly, even though like that's not good for me to be around. But that's because like my uncles would be in the backyard, like in lawn chairs, like smoking them while like I'm on my dad's lap and they're playing poker. And like these little like things are kind of more so like, oh, this is just because I know one day I'm never going to see this again, and I'm never going to experience these things again. So of my own selfishness, that is how I kind of decide what I want to research.
One last question from audience. Yes.
It's okay. I can just get some from here. So it's a bit weird because Grace is not here anymore. But I was very intrigued by the idea that what it means to be Korean American has changed over time, right? And I think the particular context, for example, of cutting in the role of thinking about Islamophobia in the American context, for example, hasn't always been exactly the same. Hasn't always been in relation to Indonesia, and I think of the way that the language and the culture around particular anti-group visions or seeing changes, right? And so what happens when one group that is subject to a certain amount of negative attention suddenly gets it flipped in the case of the Korean American experience, and not everyone is obsessed with Korean culture. And how does that sort of play into your particular voice as an artist, the way you see the world, and so on and so forth. So just to speculate or maybe think about that.
Yeah, I'm not Korean, but I feel like the question you're asking is about often geopolitics come into how you conceive of your own sense of identity. And I think it's a really important question because I feel like there is a vein of discourse that wants to stubbornly remain in the minoritarian or in the marginalized, and crucially so, but it also feels that geopolitics shift in so many ways that that there are often also majoritarian aspects to your identity where basically, you have power too in different ways, and they shift with geopolitics. So I think, at least for me, that's something I'm always trying to have as clear-eyed of a vision as possible, where it's like, okay, well, in what ways do you have power? In what way has power been taken away from you because they're so dependent often in the US on geopolitics?
Yeah, I think I'll quickly respond to it, kind of more so talking about in the Indonesian context, but like I think in a similar vein, I think there's something to kind of like note of like not only like what is focused on, but why and kind of in what context, but also similarly like in that dynamic of power, like what are kind of, not necessarily in a way of like who the person being observed is benefiting from it, but like what is the observer, quote unquote, or the analyzer, the person who is kind of deciding and hailing these ethnicities, what like are they kind of gaining and benefiting? And that like Indonesia, it's like, okay, like early 2000s, a lot of us were kind of like mass like taken away, and also like either if no one knew what Bali was, it was like, all right, like maybe like we were like constantly like surveilled in some way. But now like there's like this rise in like Indonesian food, and like, oh, what's like the best Indonesian food spot in Queens because of this hidden gem on TikTok, or also in like a similar. But like this is all to say that I think like it is a completely different context, and I think it's also not in a way where it indicates progress either, but it's just more so like what does the observer benefit by kind of analyzing said ethnicity.
I can't speak of to the specific question you said, but I can see that with US becoming really obsessed with one country to another, depending on what atrocity is happening. So, or if one country becomes really popular because of some kind of cultural reason, then that becomes the only story about a culture. I see that with India a lot. Like everything is about Bollywood, for example. And in India, actually, most of us don't even call it Bollywood; we call it Hindi film industry. So things like that. And many people wouldn't like to call it Bollywood because it's a Hindi film industry. So things like that actually, and then which means that many of the important issues of a huge country like India gets ignored, but the biryani and the Bollywood takes over because people are just so positively obsessed with it. So, but on that note, what a fascinating conversation and panel. Thank you for your generosity.